incredible group of fantastic leaders in our technology ecosystem. And what a wonderful way to kick off Tech Chicago Week. And I know we've really arrived because last year, if I remember, Brad, I think we were in a little room on the side of a restaurant with no windows. And so definitely this whole effort is exploding, which is really exciting. And as a co-founder of P33 with Chris Gladwin and Kelly Welsh, both of whom are here tonight, I just want to say how proud I am personally, and I think my co-founders are, of the incredible work that P33 is doing on behalf of Chicago. We're trying to be an important catalyst in our city that raises awareness of what a great destination Chicago is in terms of a tech ecosystem, as well as an inclusive hub for innovation. And so I just want to thank all of the folks from P33 that have made Tech Chicago possible, and I know we've got a great week of activities ahead of us. So we're the kickoff event, Secretary, and thank you. Welcome to Chicago. We're really excited to have the U.S. Secretary of Transportation join us. And so I'm going to jump right in, if that's okay. First, you've been an innovator throughout your career as a soldier, as a mayor, as a top-tier presidential candidate, and as the 19th U.S. Secretary of Transportation. So start off and tell us a little bit about your work and your priorities, and how do you infuse innovation into what you're doing at the Department of Transportation?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and really excited. I can feel the energy and the brain power buzzing around this place since we got here, and I think what you're doing is really exciting. To be brief, we have 5 major priorities at the Department of Transportation: safety, which is the reason the DOT exists; economic development; equity; climate; and innovation. And I always have a bit of an asterisk on the 5th, actually, because innovation is the one out of those 5 that's actually not a goal in itself. It exists only in furtherance of the other 4. In other words, our approach on innovation is we care about it to the extent that it helps us with safety, economic growth, climate, and equity. And I think that's important because the kinds of people who are drawn to transportation, including me, are liable to geek out on the innovation for its own sake. And sometimes we will, and that's fine, but as a policy matter. The reason all of these things matter, especially in terms of the kinds of innovation that are transforming the transportation space in our time, and there are many, is that they hold the promise of a dramatically safer transportation system. They hold the promise of a dramatically cleaner set of transportation systems. They hold the promise of delivering a new generation of economic development, both in building the infrastructure and in operating the transportation systems, that is dramatically more equitable and creates wealth on a more equitable basis than what has come before. And of course, by its nature, can be a huge economic generator. And so we're looking for ways to support an innovation ecosystem that will tend to all of those outcomes. And our policy is very much designed around that. We also have a level of humility around our role in innovation. We're not going to deliver the bulk of the technologies or the innovations, but there are times when either federally funded research or policy is necessary, either in order to launch things that the private sector would never do on its own, or to make sure that the development of those things is safe, equitable, all those other things we've been talking about. And that's where we see an extraordinary moment. I'm convinced the 2020s will bring as much transformation to transportation as any period in the last century. And that's one of the reasons this is the best time ever to have a job like mine.
That's great. Well, I'm going to infuse in here. I have some questions from the audience, which will definitely be the best questions. So Brenda Darden-Wilkerson of Anita B., who's also on the board of P33 and is someone who I have a huge amount of respect for, she raises a question I think that is going to really build on what you just said. In your exclusive interview with Bloomberg at the G7 in Japan, which I believe you were at just a couple weeks ago, you mentioned that a car is as much a computer as it is a vehicle. And she says, as a techie, she would like to know, she said, you said that tech permeates all aspects of human life today. So from your perspective, aside from moving vehicles, what other areas may be overlooked within transportation that tech can be leveraged to innovate, improve, and make more sustainable transportation?
I love this question because as excited as we are about moving vehicles, a lot of the most important and transformative technologies that will affect transportation are a little bit askew from that. Consider the most important transportation technology of the last decade, which I would argue is the smartphone. It's not even a vehicle, but it changed everything. It changed how you get a ride, it changed how you board a plane, it changed how you navigate. And so I think for that reason, we need to be on the lookout, not just for the knowable transportation developments, electric vehicles, automated vehicles, green shipping, sustainable aviation fuel, things that are on board vehicles, but things that are orthogonal to it, but they're really going to matter. And the obvious one, but it's not yet obvious how, is of course AI. About a year ago, I started to get obsessed with DALL-E, the generative drawing AI application. And I remember posting something about it, I think on my personal account in social media. And most of the replies were of the spirit of shut up and go back to transportation. But part of why that captured my attention was not just that it was very interesting to see in a shockingly on-point way what a 17th century Pokemon card would look like. But you really should look those up if you get a chance. But that this was going to mean things for transportation we can just begin to get our head around. And again, I will keep coming back to safety, which is not as sexy as the flying cars stuff, not quite as evidently sizzling technologically as the idea that AI might be indispensable to us managing the drone air traffic that's coming, which, by the way, will be for the simple reason that there's so many drones that are going to be in the sky that you couldn't possibly train and hire enough air traffic controllers to manage them the way we do regular crewed aircraft. But also the simple fact that the most important and neglected transportation mission we have, safety, is at its worst when it comes to the most commonplace form of transportation, which is roadway. Our biggest priority in aviation safety is to keep the typical number of passenger deaths in a year at 0. Our biggest fight in railroad safety is to get the number of railroad employees killed in a typical year from the single digits to 0. And since we sat down in these chairs, at least one American has been killed in a roadway incident. We're at 40,000 a year. That's a jumbo jet every 3 or 4 days. And so when I think about technology like AI, what I'm really thinking about is how do we get to the point where we can do better than the murderous track record of human eyes connected to human brains and human hands in personal vehicles? And that won't come automatically. And we may have some things go through a very strange kind of 2 steps forward, 2 steps back mode. I couldn't help but notice last year when I was at the Detroit Auto Show with the president to look at the latest and greatest there, that a lot of what they showed us was the newest safety technology is, many of you might have this, you're driving and then the car notices your eyes are off the road and it shows a little coffee cup or it dings at you and threatens to switch off the cruise control, right? Think about what that means. It means that some of the latest, greatest technology is there in order to protect you from some of the other technology that you might be leaning on too much, right? So we're in a very messy phase around this. But the promised land on the other side of it is to get to a point where roadway deaths seem as antiquated, strange, and quaint as talking about deaths from dysentery in the US in the 2020s. That's what excites me. And that's why I think we need to widen our aperture on why technology matters for transportation beyond the vehicle, even though there are, of course, so many exciting things happening in the vehicles, too.
So you must get asked this question, I certainly do, around generative AI and everyone's fear that it's going to have an impact, a negative impact on jobs. Do you see it that way when it comes to transportation?
I think a lot of it depends on how we shape it. There's an optimistic case to be made, often rooted in the analogy of the ATM, which everybody feared would pretty much be the end of employment in retail banking. And then what wound up happening was employment in retail banking grew, but it was different. You were less likely to be fetching cash out of a drawer and handing it to a customer, and you were more likely to be helping a customer navigate some kind of tricky problem. I think everybody's experimenting with generative AI as a coworker, as a co-pilot, as a productivity enhancer. I think it's far from automatic that that's how it will work. But I think there's that potential. But when I think about more straightforward AI, like vehicles, I think about the possibility, for example, of trucks that will absolutely require somebody to be on board as a safety driver, as somebody to do the administrative work, as somebody to deal with the warehouse when you actually get there, but maybe not 10, 20, 30 years from now, operating the vehicle in the way that they do today. And those are the things that are going to unfold in a way that we have to have the humility to recognize we can't yet see, but we have to make sure they actually unfold in a way that benefits workers. Because I've also seen the other side of it. Coming from northern Indiana, home of Studebaker, and a lot of auto-related supply chain companies, I've seen what happens when folks come along and they say, there's going to be a bunch of change. Don't worry about your slice of the pie, because the pie is going to get so much bigger that everybody's going to be just fine. And the latter part of the promise didn't come true. The pie got bigger, but it turned out not everybody's slices got bigger. And so we need to be really thoughtful at a period when we are globally going to create an amazing amount of potential value and wealth, that it's actually getting to everybody, the workers, the regions, the people who have been left out in the past. And that's not a technology problem. It's only partly a business problem. I think fundamentally it's a policy problem.
So as Secretary of Transportation, how do you envision emerging technologies like autonomous vehicles? And I remember, 7 years ago, autonomous vehicles were going to rule the world in about 3 years, and so far not so much. How do these emerging technologies like autonomous vehicles or smart transportation systems, how are they going to improve our infrastructure and our mobility? Because we are really struggling here with, too much traffic and a lot of challenges, even when our roads are all paved and, all the rebuilding of our infrastructure is done.
Well, here too, we're going to see it cut both ways. Like you, 7 years ago, we stood up a working group of mayors that I chaired on the subject of automation, and the widespread use of automated vehicles was a few years away, and it's been a few years away ever since. And you wonder, is it going to be a few years away a few years from now? But sooner or later, these changes will happen. Think about, on one hand, the value that could be unlocked by unwinding some kind of screwy arrangements that we have now. The fact that the second most expensive thing most people own is something they use less than 4% of the time. The fact, and this is particularly as a former mayor drives me nuts, the fact that so much of our world, and certainly so much of our cities, is dedicated to surface parking. And if you're in a world where there are a lot of TNC-style AV fleets that come and get you, there will be less need for surface parking. I've seen so many wonderful building ideas and development deals die because you couldn't figure out enough area around it to pave. On the other hand, imagine a world right now where mom and dad get into the van with their 2 kids, and then they drop one kid off at soccer practice and the other kid off at band camp, and then dad at the mall, and then mom goes over to the office to take care of something that Saturday morning. If an AV is available to everybody, that one car trip with 3 or 4 stops became 4 vehicles or pods or whatever going to 4 different places, creating 4 times as much congestion on our roads. So here too, again, policy is going to matter. Can we fuse that kind of policy with better transit options? I think we can. One other exciting thing, even before you get into automated driving, just with better tech, TNC, Uber and Lyft style tech, for example, is the idea that communities that currently rely on a hub and spoke bus model that often has 3/4 empty 40-foot buses going from this side of town here and then back out to that side of town, taking an hour to get there, could have still part of the transit system, but have the transit system operating smaller vehicles doing more point-to-point trips because they have the data in real time coming in from people's apps that they use to hail those vehicles. to allocate those resources more efficiently. So I know I'm kind of answering the question with a question, but the reality is we have to figure out the moves, the nudges, the guardrails that will lead to a safety nirvana rather than a congestion nightmare, because we could have both or neither, depending on the choices that we make around what we prioritize. And what we're prioritizing in our policy work, especially when we're funding tech and innovation through our SMART grant program, for example, is applications that will solve a specific problem, whether it's congestion, safety, a transit desert, something like that. And we're doing it in multiple phases, knowing that many of the things we fund to try out won't necessarily get to the next level, and that's okay. But the ones that do, we'll be very excited to help scale.
Government struggles with experimentation, though, so how's it going?
Yeah. And look, government struggles with experimentation for a good reason, right? I mean, if your the market discipline works by some businesses failing, and that's the evolutionary process that fosters innovation in the marketplace. But if you're responsible for not no one getting poisoned by their water, then you don't get to fail. It's just you have zero acceptable rate of failure there. So I think that's where you need to be.
Please don't experiment with like planes and things like that.
Yeah, nope. We want.
You have a margin
we're
for
looking
zero
for
error.
100.0% when it comes to, those outcomes.
Thank you.
So what does that mean? I think it means being smart about what the government's role is. And the government's role is not to do anything that could better be done by the private sector. But the government's role is to make sure that there are the right kind of guardrails for that private sector competition to be, first of all, actually competitive, which is why we're leaning in on our competition authorities in the airline industry, for example, to be fair, to be safe. And by the way, there's also a role in the innovation itself. Again, we're looking for the gaps. We're not looking to do the things that a startup should do or that a company should take to scale. But we're looking to do the things that wouldn't happen if we didn't. That's why we're standing up an ARPA-I, patterned after DARPA, for some of the things that there just won't be a market for unless we get the ball rolling. Things that could make a bridge last 500 years, self-healing concrete, those kinds of things. A long way off, but we got to start somewhere. Because I think business does such a great job of generating and scaling those multi-billion-dollar ideas. But sometimes there's a multi-trillion-dollar idea that won't come about unless you have a DARPA there to invent the internet. The federal government could never have created the iPhone, but Apple never could have invented the internet. And the more we can figure out the boundaries between those two phases of innovation, and the better we are at that, working between, and that's part of what excites me about this scene that I see here, right? Is just figuring out where the policy world, the social sector, the academic and civic world, and then the private sector, how they're all going to interact with each other. That's the exciting part, because when we get it right, amazing things can unfold. And we have to get it right, because there's a ferocious race between the US and some competitor countries who may not be as interested in some of the principles I just mentioned in the way their tech sector unfolds.
So, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to switch the subject a little bit to our beloved Chicago. We're all Chicagoans here, many of us are. You have a deep connection to Chicago. You spent a lot of time here. I understand you were proposed to at O'Hare Airport, and your mother lives here.
Yeah.
So deep connections here. This is a question from Julia Monfrini-Peave, who says, what makes our city and state so special for tech and innovation, and where do you see your priorities helping our city and region?
Sounds like a question I get some elected officials in this meeting.
Yeah.
First of all, yes, I did. Chas and I got engaged at O'Hare. Don't let anybody tell you O'Hare's not romantic. And briefly lived here when I was at McKinsey, which, by the way, it's great to be reunited with Brad Henderson, because at a period when consulting companies were recruiting graduate students, I think they wanted to find the most charismatic Rhodes Scholar they could find to persuade humanities majors that they might actually have a future in business. And he was on the job and opened doors to a lot of people in my generation there. And look, Chicago screams infrastructure. I mean, everywhere, right? It's the only place I've been where there's three-dimensional roads. Where you have to figure out, is that middle, even the GPS can't keep up, right? Is there middle whacker, lower whacker, upper whacker? It's always been that way. First the river and the lake, and then the railroads, and then the great airports. It's an infrastructure city. It's a transportation city. It's an engineering city. Nelson Algren, who was the great kind of poet of Chicago, a great poet of Chicago, said that this was the city that managed to roll down boulevards out of pig wallows and make its dark river roll uphill, right? Like that's the kind of city this is. And importantly, also a city with a very diverse business base that needs to become more so when it comes to tech and when it comes to delivering infrastructure. It's something that's on our minds a lot. Because when you're intentional about that, that makes a huge difference. Part of why Atlanta has the famous black middle class that is such an important part of the economy of Atlanta and Georgia is that when they were building their airport, Hartsfield-Jackson, the mayor was very intentional about the inclusion of black-owned construction companies in that public sector work. And without that policy intention, I don't think it would have unfolded the way that it did. So I mentioned that only to say that the building blocks that are here are amazing, whether we're talking about innovation, civic life, diversity, and a great transportation tradition. What I would like to see from the transportation perspective is helping Chicago to continue to mobilize the intellectual and entrepreneurial capital that is here, the unbelievable academic capital that is here, and the simple marvel of the location that Chicago represents is part of why Chicago grew the way it did in the first place. And we're doing just that. So we have been supporting projects ranging from the work to extend the Red Line further south, which is going to unlock opportunity for so many people who can contribute, to being involved in the work that's going on at O'Hare, to working with Senator Tammy Duckworth. This is the eve of the anniversary of the ADA, by the way. And she made sure that the infrastructure law included what's called the ASAP program, All Stations Accessibility Program, to get the legacy transit stations that are not accessible to be accessible. And we're helping to fund that around the country in places like Chicago. Hugely important work. That means not only that we're better serving Americans with disabilities who deserve to, of course, to be served equitably, but also better unlocking their ability to contribute by being able to come to work and shop and participate in the civic and economic life of the city. There are so many unlocks to be had through the right kind of spending. And sometimes it's the most prosaic thing that still excites me, like the package of bridges on the south side that we're doing, that the vice president announced as part of the first wave of our bridge program. Sometimes it'll be more under the hood for now, like the work we're doing on some of these research projects to do things like signal timing and optimizing transit. But what they all have in common is that if we get it right, Chicago and this part of the country will be able to bring together those different policy goals I laid out at the beginning and see wins in the everyday life of people, even if they don't care about transportation. They'll be safer, they'll be breathing cleaner air, they'll be better likely to get a job, they'll be building family wealth. And that's what this is really all about. So we have had no shortage of wonderful ideas and applications come in from Illinois and from Chicago for grants that we have underway. Thanks to President Biden's infrastructure law, we're able to do that in a way that wasn't possible before. I would add that under the governor's leadership here, the state's putting up a lot. And lest anybody get caught in the framework that says, oh, well, why are we investing as a state if the federal government's going to do it anyway? This is very much a both and. The more the state puts forward, the better partner we can be, the more matching there is, the more it gets done. So a state that understands the importance of infrastructure is a critical part of all of this. But we know that there's a lot of untapped potential yet, untapped human potential, and I think untapped economic potential in terms of what we could do as we get ahead of the next generation of transportation problems that will be upon us soon. as we see everything from advanced air mobility, which is I would shorthandedly describe as flying cars, to drone delivery, to the climate imperative, to the widespread use of automated vehicles, to the electric vehicle conversion, all kind of colliding over our heads in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Well, you talked a little bit about inequity, and I would say, one of the things that the P33 and the Civic Committee have been, you've got the two leaders over here at this table, have worked hard on is we're really trying to grow the diversity of our suppliers throughout the city. You see it in construction, but you also see it in, frankly, IT and other things that we have a real intentional effort going on here in Chicago. Transportation development can create inequity. And, I know it's been one of your priorities to address the harms that have been caused to working class neighborhoods and communities of color with past transportation projects. So what does it look like in a large metropolitan area like ours? How do you plan to address existing disparities or in transportation infrastructure, or to make sure that we don't create future harms?
Well, there are really two areas that we're thinking about a lot. The first is just places that don't get served right now. The metro goes a long way between, I think, the 30s and maybe the 90s without a station. There's a community called Roseland within the city limits of Chicago, a neighborhood called Roseland. And when I was here, the first time I was here as secretary engaging the CTA, I talked to folks who were explaining the struggle there of commuting into town. And what really struck me was that there's also a community called Roseland, Indiana, which is right by South Bend. If you have a car, you can get here from Roseland, Indiana, which is 90 miles away, in about the same amount of time it takes you to get to the Loop from the Roseland neighborhood of Chicago if you don't have a car and you're depending on the bus. That's got to change. And this is why we're so excited about things like the Red Line work and the other efforts, because there are transit deserts even in this great city. But the second thing, of course, is not only have a lot of neighborhoods and communities been left out of transportation, a lot of neighborhoods had investments come to them, but in the worst way. Where because that neighborhood, again, usually a black neighborhood, did not have the political power to reshape or to move a proposed highway, for example, a railroad, it went right through and cut it in two, or replaced it completely. There is a reason why I think it is only in American English that we have the expression wrong side of the tracks, which should tell you everything you need to know about how transportation infrastructure, whose purpose is supposed to be to connect, can also serve to divide, often along racial lines. We can do something about that too, and we are. The infrastructure law has the first ever dedicated federal funding to deal with this. We were in Buffalo. They've been trying to get this done through the 80s. They want to deck over, and we're now funding them to deck over the Kensington Expressway there. So the cars will still move, but it won't be a gash through the city anymore, and those neighborhoods can be reconnected, and you'll generate the scarcest thing ever, which is new land in the middle of a city. In Detroit, they're going to take I-375, and we got $100 million into this effort, and turn it into a boulevard. When they put it in, it wrecked the neighborhoods of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, but we can restore it to a boulevard that will actually connect and be an asset. Some places you don't have to go as far as to remove or depress a highway. You can do it with the right kind of transit connections or overpasses. But anyway, when we talk about this legacy, it's not to make people feel guilty. It's to do something about it. And now we're doing something about it. And then the third, to the point in your question, is make sure we do no harm as we're doing this next round. Because, if a bad tax policy could be reversed next year, effective immediately. But if you make the wrong decision with how an overpass is built or where a bridge or an airport goes, generations have to live with that. So we feel that pressure. And that's why we need to make sure there's a very high standard for community inclusion. And it's why we generally operate on the principle that we will not generate the projects, the ideas, the visions in Washington, D.C. We don't think the ideas are going to emanate from DOT headquarters. We just think more of the funding should, and now it is. And that's why this is such an exciting moment for this kind of work.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one last quick question, and it's about surprise.
Oh.
So, Mr. Secretary, when I served in government, in the Department of Commerce, the thing that surprised me was who knew the Department of Commerce had 6 Nobel Prize winners, right? But at NIST, we had all of this extraordinary talent that was helping our country in terms of setting standards being absolutely essential for the creation of commerce, business, transportation, everything. So, what surprised you at the DOT?
Well, there was a lot that the DOT covers. I mean, everybody knows we do plane, trains, and automobiles. I'm not sure everybody knows that we do hazardous material in mail, for example. So we have a brand mascot called Hazardous Matt. Get it? He's this little blue blob with an orange flame for hair. And his purpose is to remind you not to put anything dangerous in the mail, which might sound obvious, like none of you think you're going to get up tomorrow and put something dangerous in the mail. But actually, there are all kinds of weird applications like bespoke nail polish has become a thing on Etsy, I guess. And if you mail that and you don't know what you're doing, that could be incredibly dangerous. And so there are things like that we have a program called Check the Box, get it? To make sure that when you're mailing something, especially if you're a small business, you're not inadvertently conducting a hazardous material shipment and you didn't know it and a postal worker is going to get hurt. So whether it's that, whether it's commercial space travel, which I thought was pretty far out until I learned that it's happening so often that we had to engage the commercial space industry on why they might want to have some of their launches, which require us to block out a certain part of the airspace, not take place in Florida during spring break, during daytime, right? Things that just weren't on your bingo card for what you're going to be dealing with any given day. But that's part of what makes it so exciting. And we have an amazing team of people who do fantastic work, 55,000 people, everything from air traffic controllers to the people who oversee the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. And it's why I'm pretty sure I got the best job in the world.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I can safely say on behalf of everyone here, this has been we've learned a lot. We've had some laughs. This has been great. And thank you so much for helping us kick off Tech Chicago Week.
Thank you very much. Thank you.